I have been a king since I was 19 years old. I know what men do when I enter a room, the way they straighten, the way their eyes flick to my hands to gauge whether I am carrying a weapon, the way the conversation changes register like a held breath finally released into careful speech. I know what women do too. I have watched that particular performance for 17 years. The tilt of the chin, the practiced half-smile, the sudden remembering of posture that was not there a moment before. I am not ungrateful for it. A king needs people who understand what he represents. But there is a difference between what a woman shows a king and what she is when no king is watching, and I had never once found a way to see the second thing clearly. Until Vareth's Iron Ring camp. Until a nameless fighter from the eastern wastes went down in the dust, and I lay there counting. Let me tell you what I found. The Iron Ring gathering happens every 3 years on the Red Plains south of the Vareth Passes, where the land flattens into a wide, sun-hammered basin ringed by broken stone. Pack champions come from across the territory. Fighters, seconds, healers, the lords and lordlings who sponsor them. It is the oldest tradition in Vareth, older than the crowns, older than the pack laws. Before there were kings, there were men who settled disputes with bare hands and no armor, nothing between a man's worth and the world's judgment except his own endurance. I have always respected it for that. There is a clarity to bare-knuckle fighting that politics does not offer. You cannot dress up a flinch. You cannot negotiate around a dropped hand. I came to Iron Ring 57 for reasons my council knew nothing about. They thought I was making the customary royal inspection, a day's ride south, a formal appearance at the opening ceremonies, a night in the camp's lord's pavilion, then back north before the serious fighting started. I have made that appearance every 3 years since I took the crown. My council has never once thought to question it. What my council did not know was that this year I had arrived 3 days early, on a single horse, wearing Eastern Waste fighting leathers and a false name. My name in the Iron Ring camp was Drell, a fighter from the Voss border territory, recently unaffiliated, looking for a bout. Dark-haired, iron-shouldered, that much was true. The leathers were authentic. I had sourced them from a supply chain that could not be traced. No crown, no ring of rank, no wolf guard at my back. I had a bedroll, a saddlebag, and a cut lip I'd earned 2 days earlier from a sparring session that got away from me in the passes, and I looked exactly like what I was pretending to be. A hard man from somewhere nobody had heard of, with no one waiting for him and nothing to recommend him except the way he stood. I had done this before in other forms, not at the Iron Ring that had its own risks, but in the trading towns, at border gatherings, twice in the lower pack holds of the northern range. I had gone in without my crown and watched. What I was watching for was not, as my council might have assumed, military intelligence or political alignment. What I was watching for was simpler and more difficult to measure. I was watching for what people did when they thought no king was looking. I was watching specifically for what women did. In 17 years of ruling, I had been brought 43 potential mates by my council, my pack elders, my regional lord sponsors, and on one memorable occasion, a delegation of 3 senior she-wolves who had convened an unsanctioned committee and decided I was waiting too long. 43 women across 17 years. Every one of them was accomplished, well-born, correctly formatted for the role. Several were genuinely kind. 2 or 3 I could have liked in another life, under different circumstances. But I am a king, a fated-mate kingdom, Vareth. The bond is real. I have watched it in my people, watched it ignite between fighters at the Iron Ring, watched it settle into the long, steady warmth of pack-mated pairs who have been together 30 years and still reach for each other across a table. The bond knows. It does not care about correct formatting. And I had not felt it, not once across all 43. What I had felt increasingly over the past several years was something harder to name, a specific kind of tiredness, not the tiredness of ruling that I could manage, the tiredness of performing, of being read by every woman in every room before she had looked at me twice, and knowing that what she was reading was the crown, not the man wearing it. The things a woman said to a king were not the things she said to a man bleeding in the dust. I needed to know the second set of things. So Iron Ring 57, Drell of the Eastern Wastes, 3 days early with no crown and a cut lip. I spent the first afternoon walking the camp. The Iron Ring camp is substantial at its peak. 200 fighters and their seconds, 3 times that in camp staff and followers, the Lord sponsors and their retinues in their pavilions on the north side, the fighters' lean-tos and rough shelters crowding the south. There is a clear geography of status. The north side is canvas and color, banners snapping over well-made tents, healer stations with proper supply pouches hanging in neat rows. The south side is the working side, dust and leather, and the particular smell of men who train hard and sleep in their gear. The lean-tos a mix of wood frame and oiled canvas, a water trough shared between 20 men. I was quartered on the south side. That was where the unaffiliated fighters went. The first thing I noticed, and I am good at noticing things, it is part of the trade, was the healer geography. On the north side, the Lord's pavilions each had their own healer, trained, well-supplied, stationed precisely where the Lord sponsors fighters could reach them without crossing to the south. On the south side, there was a single lean-to at the far eastern edge of the camp, marked with a strip of green cloth tied to one of the frame poles, the universal healer's marker. I could see from 50 yards that the supply setup was modest, a working kit, not a display. I went about my business, registered for a bout in the second-day brackets, found my assigned lean-to on the south side and unpacked my bedroll, ate in the communal line with the other unaffiliated fighters, a rough, practical meal good enough, and listened to the camp's particular social music. Who was watching whom, which fighters were building alliances, which Lord Sponsor was short a champion and looking. I did not pay particular attention to the green cloth healer's lean-to, not yet. What I was doing that first afternoon was establishing myself as someone easy to look past, a man with no obvious sponsor, no remarkable pedigree, no reason to be noticed. It is a skill I have had to learn deliberately, because everything in my upbringing was designed to make me noticeable. I have had to unlearn the posture of authority, the particular way a man stands when he expects to be obeyed. I replaced it with something quieter, the stance of a man who has learned to be careful because he has no backup if things go wrong. By the end of the first afternoon, I was invisible. It is the most useful thing I know how to be. The second morning, I watched the healer. I had a clear line of sight from my lean-to to the green cloth station at the camp's eastern edge, and I spent the first hour of daylight learning the pattern of who went there and who didn't. The north side fighters went to their own pavilion healers. That was expected. But the south side fighters' relationship with the green cloth station was more complicated than I had anticipated. The men went when they had to. When a cut needed closing that they couldn't close themselves, when a hand needed properly taped before a bout, when something had gone wrong in sparring that was going to impair their performance if left alone. They went quickly, without looking like they were going, and they left the same way. There was, I noted, a particular social economy around being seen to need the healer. You did not want to be there longer than necessary, and you did not want to be there at all if you could manage it. Fighting men and their relationship with showing damage. What I had not expected was the direction of traffic on the north side. The Lord's daughters and the ranked women in the Lord Sponsor's retinues. There were perhaps 30 of them in the camp, variously there to watch the fighting and be seen watching it, to make the social rounds of the pavilions, to present themselves to potential matches. Did not, as a rule, come to the south side. This was not a written rule. It was just the shape of things. The south side was the working side, it smelled like it looked like it, and there was nothing on the south side that the north side women needed. Except occasionally, One of them did come to the green cloth lean-to. I watched 3 of them over the course of the morning. Each one approached from the north with a particular kind of purposefulness. The carriage that says I am slumming but I know it stopped at the lean-to for whatever they needed, a remedy for dust sickness in one case, some kind of preparation for chapped skin in another. The third I couldn't make out from my distance, and then returned north without a wasted moment. Not rude, exactly. Simply efficient. The south side was a stop, not a stay. I was beginning to build a picture. At mid-morning, a fighter from the bracket 2 spots above mine took a bad fall in a sparring session near the ring. I was close enough to see it happen. He caught his foot on a loose rope edge, went down at a terrible angle, and the sound when his shoulder met the ground was not a sound you want to hear. He was up in seconds, you are, at the iron ring, because going down and staying down is its own humiliation, but he was moving wrong, and everybody watching could see it. His second started toward him, then stopped. Because crossing the camp to the green cloth lean, to meant passing through the south side common ground with a visibly injured fighter, and there were north side observers at the edge of the working ring. And the second, a young man, worried about his fighter's reputation, had done the quick social calculation that fighting men do, and decided that the thing to do was get his man to his lean-to first, horizontal, out of sight, and then figure out the shoulder. I watched this happen, I noted it. Then I went back to watching the lean-to. And I saw her come out. She had not been watching the sparring session. She had been inside her lean-to, doing whatever healers do between patients, and she had evidently heard the sound of the fall. Because she came out of the lean-to, looked across the camp toward where it had happened, assessed the situation in roughly 3 seconds, picked up her working kit, and started walking. Not toward the fighter. Not yet. She was angling first to intercept the second, who was still standing near his man trying to make the calculation work, and she said something to him, too far for me to hear, that made him look relieved. Then she went to the fighter. I watched her work for 15 minutes. She was not dramatic about it. She did not perform competence, she simply had it. The shoulder was badly wrenched, not separated. I could tell that from 20 yards based on the way the fighter was holding it, and she had it assessed in under a minute. She strapped it with practiced economy, spoke to the fighter the whole time in a low, steady voice, and when she was done she stayed for another 5 minutes talking to him. Not clinical follow-up talk. Just talk. He was frightened, a man with a bad shoulder at a fighting camp where his bracket bout was in 2 days, and she knew that, and she was addressing the fear as well as the shoulder. I had not expected that. I watched her walk back to the green cloth lean-to. Mid-height, practical build, her hair pinned up with the kind of pins that get the job done and no others. Her boots were worn. I could see the risoled toe even at distance, the particular flatness of a boot that has been worked back to usefulness more than once. Her apron was clean but not new. Her kit was modest, a working healer's supplies, not the comprehensive spread of the North Side stations. No rank markers, no sponsoring Lord's color on her shoulder. An independent healer at the iron ring, which meant she had come on her own fee, which meant the fee was whatever the fighters on the South Side paid her for her services, which based on my assessment of the South Side economy was not a great deal. I spent the rest of that day cataloging what I had seen, and what I had not yet seen. What I had not seen, her turning anyone away. What I had not seen, her making the South Side fighters feel like a lesser category of patient. What I had not seen, her with the efficient carriage of the North Side women when they came down to collect their remedies. What I had seen, a woman who came out of her lean-to when she heard someone fall. I decided it was time to fall. I want to be accurate about this. I did not engineer it dishonestly. I had registered for a bout in the second-day brackets that was real, and it happened. My opponent was a good fighter, properly matched in terms of weight and reach, and the bout itself was legitimate. I went in without holding anything back, because I respect the iron ring and I respect the men who fight there, and because fighting poorly on purpose is its own kind of dishonesty. But I also went in knowing that I had not been to a real bout in 8 months, that the South Side sparring session I'd been in the previous day had told me my left hand speed was not where it needed to be, and that a genuinely matched opponent at the iron ring on his home bracket was going to find the gap in my defense before the end of the second round. He did, a right hand that came through clean when my left wasn't quite where it should have been, and I went down. I lay in the dust outside the ring. We had gone over the ropes in the fourth exchange, which happens, and I counted. The man who'd knocked me down checked whether I was breathing and then went back in. That was correct. That was what you did. My bout second, a hired man who didn't know me from anyone, crouched next to me for 30 seconds and then stood up and looked around to see if there was any support incoming before making his own assessment of priorities. The fighters who had been watching moved back to the ring. 3 men who had been sitting on the near fence moved away. A Lord Sponsors man who had been observing the brackets from the northern edge of the working area looked at me, made a judgment, and continued writing in his ledger. I lay in the dust and I felt my lip open again from the fall and the blood was warm on my chin and I thought, all right, now we find out. I counted 60 seconds. Nobody stopped. 70, 80. My bout second had found someone else to talk to. At 110 seconds, I heard footsteps. Not the quick footsteps of someone who had noticed the blood and wanted to see how bad it was before committing to a response. These were the footsteps of someone already committed, moving at a pace that meant the decision had been made before she got close enough to assess the details. She crouched next to me. I had not moved. I was genuinely dizzy, the fall had been real and lying still was not a performance. She said, "Don't move for a moment, just breathe." She did not ask my name. She did not ask who my sponsor was. She put 2 fingers against the side of my neck, counting my pulse, and her touch was steady and cool and completely without ceremony. I breathed. "The eye's going to swell," she said, conversationally, as if she were commenting on weather. "You've got a cut on your lip that needs a stitch or it'll open again every time you talk. Can you tell me how many fingers?" She held up 2. 2, I said. "Good," she was already opening her kit. "Stay still. I need to look at the back of your head. You went down on the right side." She looked. Her fingers were careful in my hair, checking for the particular soft spot that means a bad impact. I felt her find the raised area where I had caught the ground and heard her quiet intake of breath. "That's going to hurt for a few days," she said. "Nothing broken, but you're not fighting tomorrow." "I have a bout." "I know. You're still not fighting tomorrow." She said it without apology or softening. Not unkindly, simply as a fact she was reporting, the same way she would report the color of a bruise. "Sit up slowly when you're ready. Don't rush it." I sat up slowly. She was already preparing the stitching kit for my lip, the small, clean needle, the gut thread, the preparation that would numb the area. She worked with the kit open on the ground beside her, everything arranged with the particular efficiency of someone who does this regularly and does not think about efficiency consciously. It is simply how the parts of things relate to each other. I watched her hands. And that was when I felt it. She had finished the lip. I had barely felt the stitches, which told me something about her skill, and she reached for my hands. Not asking. Simply taking my right hand, turning it palm up, checking the knuckles from the bout. The contact was clinical, professional. The kind of contact that healers exchange with patients dozens of times a day without any charge to it. Except that the moment her hands closed around mine, something happened that I can only describe as a silence. Not an external silence. The camp was as loud as it had been. Fighters calling across the working area, the sound of a second-day sparring match starting up somewhere to the west, the general drum of 200 people existing in a tight geographic space. None of that stopped. The silence was internal. In my chest, in my wolf, in the place behind my sternum where 17 years of looking had left a particular kind of hollowness. That hollowness closed. Not with anything I had chosen, or any word I had said, or any performance of anything. It just closed, as if a door that had been standing open for a very long time had finally, quietly found its frame. I looked down at my hand in hers. On my wrist, on the thin skin of the inside of my wrist where the veins run close to the surface, I saw the mark beginning, not fully formed, but there, a warmth that was also a color, gold-threaded and slow, like the first amber in winter sunrise, spreading from the point of her contact outward in both directions along the wrist. I had seen mate marks form before. I had watched them on my people, the shock of recognition, the way both partners looked down at once, the particular silence that precedes understanding. I knew exactly what this was. I looked at her wrist. The same warmth, the same spreading. She had not noticed yet. She was focused on my knuckles, running her thumb along the ridge of bone between my second and third fingers where there was swelling, and the care she was giving that examination was all her attention. I did not say anything. I did not trust myself in that moment to say anything useful. She looked up. "The third knuckle's bruised, not broken," she said. "But you've been fighting with your hands improperly wrapped. I can show you the right binding before your next bout if you do fight again. Which won't be tomorrow." She began wrapping my hands. And somewhere in the middle of the wrapping, she glanced down at her wrist. She went still for half a second, then continued wrapping. I waited. After another moment, she said, without looking up, "Has that happened to you before?" "No," I said. "The warmth, I mean, on the skin." She was still wrapping, her hands steady. "I've heard of it. Fever sometimes presents that way, but you don't have a fever." A pause. "I don't have a fever either." "No," I said, "I don't think it's fever." She tied off the wrapping, sat back on her heels, looked at her wrist for a moment. The mark was still there, clearly there, the gold-amber warmth visible even in the dusty midday light. Then she looked at me. She had gray eyes, the kind of gray that is not flat but layered, darker at the outer edge, lighter toward the center. She looked at me with them for a long moment, and then she said, "I don't know what that is." "I know what it is," I said. She waited. She was, I had already noticed, a woman who waited well, who did not fill silence with performance. "But I'm not going to explain it now," I said, "because you're right that I shouldn't fight tomorrow and I need to rest, and this is not the moment for that conversation." She held my gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she said, "All right," and began closing her kit. It was the most remarkable thing anyone had said to me in 17 years of being a king. I spent the next 2 days in the camp as Drell from the Eastern Wastes, a fighter sitting out his next bout with a wrenched shoulder and a stitched lip, and I followed her without following her. Which is to say, I made no particular effort to be in her path, but I made no particular effort not to be either, and the camp being what it was, our paths crossed in the ordinary way of a small, busy geography. I learned her name from the camp registration list, which was posted at the main water station. Lena, independent healer, registered on her own account, quartered in the eastern lean-to. I learned the rest of her from watching. She worked longer hours than any of the North Side Pavilion healers. She was the last lantern on in the camp most nights, and I say this as a man who was also awake most of those nights, lying in my bedroll calculating what to do about the fact that I had found my fated mate at a bare-knuckle fighting camp while pretending to be someone else, wearing someone else's name, and now had to figure out how to introduce the truth without the introduction itself being a kind of betrayal. The bond was a fact. I did not question it. My wolf had settled into a steady certainty that I had never felt before in my life, a quietness, a rightness, and the mate mark on my wrist had continued its slow spread through the first night and then stabilized, a permanent warmth, gold amber, 2 finger widths wide. I kept it covered with my sleeve. I needed to handle this correctly. What I watched in those 2 days was this. A fighter from the mid-brackets with a developing infection and a hand injury who was about to lose his bout eligibility and possibly the hand itself, who came to Lena's lean-to ashamed and late because the infection had progressed to a state that was frightening, and he had been too proud to come earlier. She received him without a word about the timing. She worked on his hand for an hour. He kept his hand and his bracket. A boy too young to be at the iron ring, but there as a camp runner for one of the Lord-sponsor retinues, who fell off the camp supply wagon and scraped a significant portion of one knee along the ground. He was not a fighter and not a fighter's charge, which meant technically none of the formal healer stations were his resource. He showed up at the green cloth lean-to with a bloody knee and a look that said he expected to be turned away. Lena sat him on her supply crate and cleaned the knee with the same attention she gave the fighters. The group of North Side women who came to the lean-to on the second afternoon. This was the interaction I watched most carefully. There were 4 of them, 3 lords' daughters and a senior-ranked she-wolf from one of the Eastern sponsoring houses, and they came in a group, which was itself a kind of statement, and they came at the unhurried pace of people who expect the space to reorganize around their arrival. They were not cruel. I want to be accurate about this. They did not say anything actively unkind. What they said was the kind of thing that is said by people who have never had to think about the social positioning of what they say. They asked for certain preparations that were either not available at the lean-to or that were phrased in ways that implied the lean-to stock was an inferior version of what they might have gotten at the North Side pavilions. They talked to each other, in Lena's presence, about the fighting camp as a temporary inconvenience, the way one talks about a place when one is certain that the place does not have feelings about the conversation. One of them, at some point, said something about the South Side fighters, not brutally, but in the easy shorthand of a person who has sorted the world into categories and does not question the sorting, and laughed, and the others laughed. Lena gave them what they needed. She was polite. She was not warm, but she was not cold either. She was simply the version of herself that she had learned to be in that kind of room, present, functional, small. After they left, she stood at the lean-to entrance for a moment looking out at the camp, with an expression I could not fully read at distance. Then she turned back in and went to work. I had seen enough. I had, if I am being honest with myself, seen enough within the first hour of the first morning. But I had spent 2 more days watching because I wanted to be sure that what I had felt when she took my hand was not simply the shock of novelty. A king who had lived inside his crown for so long that any genuine, uncalculated human contact would have felt like revelation. I wanted to know that it was her specifically, and not the absence of crown. By the end of the second day, I had my answer. It was her specifically. The bond was not in question. The bond had not been in question from the moment of contact. But I am a king, and a king is supposed to be certain before he acts, and I was certain. I spent the night of the second day composing what I was going to say and then abandoning all of it. There was no composition that worked. Every version I tried had the same problem. It began with a lie being corrected, and there was no way to correct a lie gracefully regardless of how long you worked on the language. I decided in the end that the only thing to do was to stop composing and simply be true. The third evening, the camp gathered at the central fire ring. This was tradition at the iron ring midpoint. The day's bouts were done, the results posted, the brackets set for the final day, and the fighters in camp gathered around the central fire for the event that had no official name but that everybody called the witness. It was the part of the iron ring where things were made public, alliances announced, sponsorships confirmed, the occasional territorial dispute settled by declaration in front of assembled witnesses rather than by continued fighting. It happened by firelight, and it happened in front of everyone, and that was the point. I had been thinking about this since the second afternoon. I went to my lean-to and I changed. Not everything. I kept the fighting leathers, that was deliberate, but I put on the ring, the signet of Vareth's kingship, silver and iron, worn on my left hand, which I had carried in my saddlebag for 3 days in a small wrapped cloth. I put on the riding cloak I had also kept in the saddlebag, plain faced to the south side, but lined with the particular charcoal and gold that any senior pack member in Vareth would recognize. That was all, 2 objects, it was enough. I walked to the central firing as the gathering was assembling, the fighters along the inner ring, the camp staff and followers behind, the Lord sponsors and their retinues in their appropriate positions to the north. I took a position at the south side edge, which was where a south side fighter would stand, which was where I had been standing for 3 days. I looked for Lena. She was at the back of the south side gathering, which was also where she would be. Not a fighter, not a sponsor, at the edge of things the way she was always at the edge of things. She had her kit at her feet, because she brought her kit everywhere in the same way that some people carry their identity with them at all times as a hedge against forgetting who they are. She had not seen me yet. The evening's witness proceeded in its usual way. 3 sponsorship confirmations, a territorial declaration from one of the Eastern Lord houses, the announcement of the final day bracket. The fire was high. The light on the assembled camp was the warm, specific orange of a fire at dusk, when the sky is still pale above and the ground is going dark, and it made everyone look, briefly, like they belonged in an older story. When the bracket announcement finished and the witness was technically complete, I stepped forward. There is a particular way a king steps forward. I had tried for 3 days not to do it. I had modulated the posture, the pace, the use of space. But now I let it go, and I was aware, with the clarity that comes from having deliberately suppressed something, of the way the space changed when I stepped into it. The fire was to my left. I stepped into the light. I did not speak immediately. I let the ring settle. I watched the recognition happen in stages, moving outward from the nearest observers. The fighters closest to me catching something in the posture first, then the Lord sponsors seconds, then the Lord sponsors themselves, and I saw the moment the senior man from House Aldrath, the largest sponsor at this year's Iron Ring, a man I had spoken with at formal court 4 months ago, recognized my face. He said nothing. He was, to his credit, a man of sense. He went still and he waited. The recognition moved through the gathered camp like a slow wave. I spoke when it had reached the far edges. I came to the Iron Ring 3 days early, I said. My voice carries, it has always carried, a useful thing in a king, without my name, without my ring. I held up my left hand, the signet visible. I wanted to see what the camp was when no king was watching. The central fire cracked. The camp was silent. I saw a man fall from a supply wagon, I said, and a fighter with an infected hand who was too proud to come early, and I saw which healers came to the south side and which ones went back north. I paused. I saw who stopped when someone went down in the dust. I walked across the central ring, past the fire, past the fighters along the inner edge, past the Lord Sponsor's men, past the ranked women of the north side retinues who were standing very still. I walked the full width of the gathering, and I walked it slowly, because I wanted everyone to see the direction. I stopped in front of Lena. She had seen me coming. She had not moved. She was standing with her kit at her feet and her hands quiet at her sides, and she was looking at me with the particular expression of a woman who has prepared herself for something she cannot quite calculate, not fear, not performance, but a kind of careful stillness, the same stillness she had had when she sat back on her heels in the dust and looked at her wrist for the first time. I said, "May I see your hands?" She looked at me for 1 full second. Then she held out her hands, palms up, the way you hold out your hands to someone you've decided to trust even though you don't yet fully understand why. Both wrists visible in the firelight, The mate mark gold amber steady, 3 days of it, permanent now and not going anywhere. I know what that is, I said quietly. Not just to her, I was aware of the audience, and that was partly the point, but mostly to her. I told you I knew. I said the moment wasn't right to explain. You said that, she agreed. Her voice was steady, which steadied me. The moment is right now, I said, because I'd rather do this in front of witnesses than alone, so that when I name you, there's no question about what was seen and by whom. I reached for her hands. I turned them gently, still palms up, and looked at the marks on her wrists, gold in the firelight, warmer now than they had been in the dusty midday light when she first noticed them. The same marks were on my wrists. I let the cloak fall open so the lining showed, and I felt rather than saw the Lord sponsors adjust, the slight movement of people sorting through their mental catalogues to find the charcoal and gold of Vareth royal line. Then I looked up at her. Lena, I said, independent healer, registered on her own account, quartered in the eastern lean-to. I said all of it because I wanted it on record, wanted it in the official memory of the witness. The way the world had categorized her was going into the record too, right before I changed her category for good. You took the stitches out of my lip yesterday and told me I was not fighting today. You were correct on both counts. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. My name, I said, is Aldrich, King of Vareth. I felt her hands tighten slightly in mine, not pulling back, just the involuntary physical adjustment of someone recalibrating significant information. The mark on your wrist is a faded mate bond mark, I said. It's on mine as well. It started when you took my hand in the dust. I paused. I've been looking for it for 17 years. I want you to know that I'm not asking you to take anything on faith that can't be demonstrated. The mark is demonstrable. Another pause. But I'm also not going to pretend in front of this many people that I don't know what it is and what I intend. What do you intend? She said. Quietly. Just for me, not for the firing. The camp could not have heard her over the wind and the distance. But I was close and I heard her clearly. To take you home, I said. When you're ready, on whatever terms you name. There's no calendar on it and no condition. I held her gaze. But I'd like to start by asking here, now, whether you'll let me put my cloak around your shoulders, so that the people in this camp who have had 17 years to choose what they thought of you have the chance to revise their thinking in real time. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked briefly to the north side of the firing, a quick, specific glance, the kind you make when you are very deliberately not making a longer one, and then back at me. She said yes. I unclasped the riding cloak. It was not a ceremony cloak. That would have been theatrical, and I had not wanted theatrical. It was a working king's cloak, the kind you ride in, that has real weather on it, charcoal and gold lining visible when it falls open. I settled it around her shoulders. It was too large for her. She was a head shorter than me, and it pooled at the hem, and she reached up and held the front together with one hand the way you do when a cloak belongs to someone bigger than you, practically, without fuss. She looked in that moment exactly like herself, not a transformed version. Herself, with a cloak around her shoulders that announced a truth that had been true since I lay in the dust and started counting. I turned to face the firing. The mate mark is witnessed, I said, formal now because the witness required it to be formal. The bond is permanent and bilateral. I name her Lena of Vareth, pack bonded to the king's line, fated mate to the Alpha King by the old law. I paused. I'm taking her home when the iron ring concludes. Anyone with a question about that is welcome to bring it to court. There were no questions. The camp was very quiet. The fire was very loud comparatively. I looked at House Aldrath's senior man. He was the highest-ranking lord present, technically, and the witness needed a lord's acknowledgement under the old law. He bowed, the full bow. Then he looked at the gathered camp and made a small, deliberate gesture with his right hand that meant, in the old pack sign language that all the senior lords still knew, I witnessed it. It's done. I looked at Lena. She was looking at the fire, with the expression of someone processing an extraordinary amount of information while keeping their face responsible. Then she looked at me. The gray eyes, layered and careful. I have patients tomorrow morning, she said. I'm not leaving before they're seen. No, I agreed, of course not. She nodded, as if this were any negotiation, any ordinary practical matter being settled at the end of a regular day. Across the firing in the assembled North Side retinue, the 4 women who had come to the Linta 2 afternoons ago were standing in a group. I knew, without looking directly at them, that they were standing very still. I had been a king for 17 years. I know the sound of a silence that is full of revision. I did not look at them. I looked at Lena, who was holding my cloak closed with one hand, practical about the size difference, not performing anything. She saw her patients in the morning. All of them. The fighter with the strapped shoulder, the camp runner with the scraped knee, 2 others I hadn't known about, a sparring injury from the previous day, a man from the overnight bracket who had caught a bad fall on his non-fighting hand. She moved through them with the same attention she had given every patient for 3 days, which was to say complete attention, rationed to nobody. I watched from near the water station and did not interfere. When she was done, she closed her kit, stripped her apron, and looked across the camp to where I was waiting. I had my horse ready. Her bedroll and her own pack were already loaded. She had packed them herself at dawn, which she had told me she would do, and I had said I could send someone to help, and she had said she was capable of packing her own bedroll, which was accurate. She walked across the camp to meet me. The camp watched. Openly, by that point, after the night's witness, there was no pretense about who was watching and why. She stopped in front of me and looked up at the horse, which was a good horse, larger than she was used to, and I watched her make the practical assessment of how to mount it. I offered my hand. She took it, and the mark on my wrist flared gold when our palms met, warm and immediate, the same warmth as the first time, not diminished by the intervening 3 days but not any louder either. Steady. That was the word for it. The bond was steady, like a thing that had always been there and had simply been waiting for us to find it. She mounted. I swung up behind her. She was already adjusting the cloak around herself against the morning wind, practical about the thing, pulling it properly closed. I gathered the reins. We rode north, out of the Iron Ring camp, through the Red Dust Basin, and up toward the Varith passes where the road to the hold began. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then she said, "The fight you lost on purpose." "No," I said, "genuinely lost." A pause. "You didn't seem like someone who loses." "I don't lose regularly," I said. "I was 8 months off the real practice. The man who beat me was properly trained and I was not, and he found the gap in my defense because it was there." She considered this. "Do you fight often?" she said. "Not as often as I should. It's part of the Varith tradition. The Alpha King maintains a fighting standard, not as a performance but as a real thing. I've let it slip." I paused. "My council doesn't think it's important. My wolf disagrees." She made a quiet sound that might have been amusement. "Then, how long have you been looking?" 17 years, I said. She was quiet for a moment. "That's a long time." "Yes." "Were you looking at the Iron Ring specifically? Or was that?" "I was looking for what I found," I said, "which was a woman who would stop when someone went down in the dust. I didn't know I was going to find it at the Iron Ring. I've looked in other places." She was quiet again. Then she said, "The women who came to my lean-to 2 afternoons ago." "I saw that. I thought you might have." A pause. "It didn't surprise me," she said, not with bitterness, simply reporting. I've been working the south side of one camp or another since I started. That's the geography of it. I'm used to where I stand. You won't have to be used to it anymore, I said. She turned her head slightly, and I could feel her thinking, the particular quality of a woman who is deciding how to respond to a thing, rather than simply responding. Then she said, I'll believe that when I see it, not because I doubt you, because I think it will take some time before I've adjusted to what it means. That's fair, I said. And I'd like to keep working, she said. Whatever else changes, there will be people in Vareth Hold who need a healer. There are, I said. The Hold's current healer is excellent, but she's been asking for an additional practitioner for 3 years, and my Chamberlain has been too slow about finding one. A pause. So I'd be useful, she said. You'd be essential, I said, on multiple counts. I felt more than heard her exhale, a breath that was releasing something, the specific something of a woman who has held a shape for a long time and is beginning, cautiously, to let it go. We were at the passes now, the red dust of the plain giving way to the pale stone of the mountain road, the wind shifting from the south-facing basin to the cooler draft of the mountain cuts. The morning was clear. Vareth Hold was a day's ride north, and I knew every stone of the road. She said, Did you know, before you took my hand? No, I said. I knew what I was looking for. I didn't know I'd found it until I felt it. When did you feel it? When you took my hand to check the knuckles, I said. The cut lip was before that. You'd already stitched the lip and the bond hadn't fired. It happened when you held my hand. A pause, that's very specific. Mate bonds are specific, I said. That's the point of them, I think. They're not interested in approximately right. They're interested in exactly right. She looked out at the mountain road ahead of us, the pale stone and the morning light on it, the far line of the Vareth passes lifting toward the sky. I've been to a lot of camps, she said eventually. A lot of south sides, a lot of men who needed stitches. I know, I said. I wasn't looking for anything. I know. She was quiet again, then asked me about my hands. I stilled. You said, she continued calmly, at the firing you asked to see my hands. I'd like to know why you asked it that way, specifically before the naming. I thought about it for a moment, about how to be accurate. Because, I said, the hands were what told me, not the face, not the conversation, not the mark on your wrist. The hands I saw from 20 yards away, crossing the camp to get to a fighter nobody else was moving toward. The hands that stopped when no one else did. I wanted to say it in front of everyone. To name the thing that I had seen before anything else, before the bond, before the mark. The thing you did when you thought no king was watching. She did not respond immediately. When she did, it was quiet. That was a good answer. I had a long time to think about how to be a king, I said. I haven't always had a long time to think about how to be a person. That answer came from the person. She turned her head fully, looking at me over her shoulder, and for the first time in 3 days, the first time since she had sat back on her heels in the dust and looked at me with those layered gray eyes, she smiled. Not the professional, careful expression I had catalogued in the camp. The real one, smaller and warmer and entirely her own. All right, she said, show me what Vareth looks like. I did. She kept her promise about the patients. She always has. The Hold's healer, Marit, who had indeed been requesting an additional practitioner for 3 years, and said so to Lena directly and without ceremony within the first hour of their introduction, set her up in the eastern wing of the medical quarter, which had better light than the rest, and which Lena rearranged twice in the first week, until it was correctly proportioned for the work she did. I learned about the rearranging from Marit, who reported it with the approval of one professional recognizing another, and I did not offer any opinion on the rearrangement because it was not my room and the light in the eastern wing is genuinely better. The naming ceremony, formal, for the court record, happened a month after we returned. Lena wore a dress that was her own choice, and that was not what my Chamberlain had suggested. It was a particular dark gray blue that I had not seen on her before, and she stood in the ceremony hall with the same quality of stillness she had had in the camp. Not a performance of composure, simply actual composure. The mate marks showed at her wrists, gold amber in the ceremony candlelight, bilateral and permanent, witnessed by everyone in the hall. My counsel had had questions. Naturally. An independent healer from the south side of an Iron Ring camp, no house, no sponsoring lord, no category that their existing systems recognized as appropriate, they had questions. I had answers. The answers were, in essence, the bond is real and bilateral and witnessed. Her record at every camp she's worked is one of complete care without exception, and I did not ask my counsel to choose my mate, and so they do not have input on who she is, only on the protocols of the acknowledgement, which I am happy to follow. They followed the protocols. House Aldrath's senior lord, who had been at the witness, sent a formal congratulation that was 3 pages long and unusually warm for a political letter, and included in it a line about having observed the healer's work at the Iron Ring, and wishing to note for the court record that the standard of care on the south side of the camp under her single practitioner management had been substantially higher than in previous years. I showed this to Lena. She read it twice and then set it down and said, "He didn't have to do that." No, I agreed. She thought about it. "Did you ask him to?" No, I said, and I held her gaze so she could confirm it. She confirmed it. "Good," she said. "I wouldn't have liked it if you had." "I know." She picked the letter back up and read it a third time, and I watched something soften in her face. Not the careful, responsible expression, not the professional steadiness, but the real face underneath it, the one that was beginning, slowly and on its own terms, to believe what had happened to her. The 4 women from the Iron Ring North Side retinue, the Lord's daughters and the ranked she-wolf from House Esther, were, of course, at the formal naming ceremony. Vareth's court protocol required it. Their lords sponsored major Iron Ring brackets and were therefore court-adjacent, which meant invitations. I had not engineered this. It was simply the geography of things. Lena knew they would be there. I had told her in advance because she deserved to know in advance rather than to see them across the room and have to compose herself without preparation. She had said, "All right," and then, after a pause, "I'm not going to make anything of it." "You don't have to," I said. "I know," she said. "I just want to for my own account." She looked at me. "There's a difference between a grudge and a record. I keep a record. I don't carry grudges. They make the hands unsteady." I had thought about that sentence for several days afterward. In the ceremony hall, the 4 women were in their correct positions in the gathered court, and they observed what the rest of the court observed. The naming, the formal acknowledgement of the mate bond, the marks visible on both wrists, the King of Vareth standing in the ceremony hall with a woman he had found in the dust of an Iron Ring camp, and intending everyone present to understand exactly what she was to him. I do not know precisely what it felt like to stand in that hall if you had walked past the green cloth lean-to at the wrong speed on the wrong afternoon. I have an imagination, but it has limits. What I know is that Lena did not look at them, not once in the entirety of the ceremony. She looked at me and at Marit, who was standing in the position of witness, and at the assembled court, and she held the marks visible and her chin level, and she was entirely herself. The dress was the right dark blue. The marks were the right gold. The composure was actual. That was enough for me. That was more than enough. She asked me once, not long after the ceremony, in the quiet of the eastern corridor outside the medical wing when I had come to find her between court sessions, and we were standing in the particular late afternoon light that comes through the eastern windows at that hour, which she had told me was her favorite light in the hold. She asked me once if I had been scared. "When you lay down in the dust," she said, "and counted, knowing you might count all the way to a large number, and nobody would come. I thought about it honestly. No, I said, not scared. It would have told me what I needed to know, either way. She nodded slowly. What would you have done, she said, if no one had stopped? Gone home, I said. Look somewhere else. The bond was going to be real wherever it found me. I just had to find the right place to look. I paused. But I was glad someone stopped. I was glad it was the right kind of stopping. She looked at the evening light on the stone floor. You're going to have to actually practice your fighting, she said. I laughed. It surprised me, not the thought, but the ease of it, the laughing, the way the sound filled the corridor without effort. It had been a long time since I laughed in a corridor by myself, easy and unperformed. You're right, I said, I know. I can't keep stitching your lip, she said. I have other patients. You can stitch my lip whenever necessary, I said. I consider it one of the privileges of the arrangement. She turned to look at me with the layered gray eyes, and the corner of her mouth moved in the way I had learned, by then, to read as the real smile getting ready to surface. Go run your court, she said. In a moment, I said, and I reached for her hand. She gave it to me, easily, the way she did now, without ceremony, without calculation, the hand simply there in mine. The mate mark was warm against my palm, gold amber and steady, permanent as bone. I looked at her hands for a moment. The working hands, the capable hands, the hands that had crossed the camp in Iron Ring 57 when a man lay in the dust and nobody stopped, the hands that had found me before they knew they were looking. Outside the eastern windows, Vareth Hold was going into evening, the light reddening over the passes, the camp sounds of the hold settling into the lower register of late day. My wolf was quiet, entirely quiet, for the first time in 17 years of searching. Thank you, I said, for stopping. She squeezed my hand once, steady, unhurried, exactly her. I always stop, she said. That's the thing about me, I always stop. I know, I had counted on it.